Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Roger Tatoud. I'm Deputy Director in the HIV Program and Advocacy Department at the International AIDS Society. And it is my pleasure to open the sixth and final panel discussion in our series of online events on design approaches for current and future HIV prevention efficacy trial. I'd like to welcome all participants and all panelists who will be introduced shortly. Today, we continue the previous panel discussions looking into future efficacy trial design approaches and the very important topic of community engagement and involvement in HIV vaccine prevention clinical research. I will introduce a few housekeeping rules for this webinar. Please note that all participants are muted. We encourage you to send questions to our panelists at any time through the Q&A box. This is the icon Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and you can bring it up by clicking on it. Should you have any problem with Zoom itself, use the chat box instead. Please remember to focus your question on today's webinar's theme. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Linda Gale-Becker, who does not need any introduction, and who on the contrary will introduce this webinar. Handing over to you, Linda Gale.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks so much to everyone. It's a real pleasure to start this, this webinar, number 6 in a very important series, and I hope that you've been able to attend all of them. If not, the good news is they are still available online, and I really encourage you to find the time to revisit if you were able to take them in or see for the first time previous versions of the webinars that have been put together by the HIV vaccine enterprise, as well as other partners. And in that regard, I want to thank Roger, together with Veronica Miller, Deborah Donnell, Stephen Wallace, and Holly James, all of whom convene regularly to put an excellent series together. This one is really the cherry on the top, in my opinion, because there is no way that we can do the clinical research that is needed to end the HIV epidemic without the full and complete involvement of community at large. And that word community is obviously many things to many people. And I'm really looking forward to the next hour when you will hear some key members of what we call our community team and community group who will be sharing their valuable ideas. The Global Vaccine Enterprise works to advocate, create awareness, and also be an activist group towards an HIV vaccine. They convene stakeholders new and old to keep the vision of a preventive vaccine alive and disseminate factual information about HIV vaccine research. But of course, HIV vaccines, although the holy grail for prevention, fall squarely within that broader group of very important aspects of our HIV response, namely primary prevention in general. And we have, without doubt, seen a revolution in HIV prevention in the last decade, with everything from oral PrEP, new types of oral PrEP drugs, the vaginal ring making it into the arena recently, long-acting PrEP cabotegravir, and trials starting in this year with monthly islatravir, oral TAF in women, and long-acting lenacapavir. Truly is an exciting time. And of course, in the midst of all of this, we have HIV vaccine trials in the field all the way from phase 1 through phase 3. A very exciting time, but also, as we have tried to highlight in many different ways over the last 6 webinars, an increasingly complex environment as we have to figure out together how we not only actually design and conduct these trials, but how we disseminate and transmit good information to communities and to the world at large, so that everybody can participate in this important work. And so without a single moment's more time wasted, it is my pleasure now to hand over to Matt Rose from HealthCap, who is going to be your convener, your moderator for what I think will be a very exciting hour together. So over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenda. I'm excited to start this panel. I will be your master, mistress, and madam of ceremonies today. So get in line, get ready. It's going to be a ruckus show. And we're going to change things up just a little because I like to keep my panelists on their toes. We're going to start with some speed dating introductions. So panelists, you are going to say who you are and what your community, however you're deciding your community is, perceives clinical research. And we're going to start with one, the only Dazon Dixon Diallo.
Of course, Matt. Thank you very much, Matthew, and to Linda Gale as well, and to Raja for those fantastic introductions. So I'm Dazon Dixon Jallow. I'm founder and president of Sister Love in Atlanta, Georgia in the US, and I'm founder and president of Sister Love International South Africa, based in Johannesburg in South Africa. My community's perception of research is, what y'all doing with that research? So that's literally, when I say I want to answer a question with a question, that's the question that my community consistently is going to ask every time we talk about a study, every time we talk about some research, anytime we talk about data that's coming out of research. My community wants to know what y'all gonna do with that research that benefits me, that matters to me, that gives me some sense of priority, or that you even care about my community. So that, I think, is how my community perceives research is, what are y'all gonna do with it in a way that I understand and in a way that I can see how it benefits me?
Excellent. Next, we'll go to one and only my friend, Jim Pickett.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Matt. My name is Jim Pickett. I'm the Senior Director of Prevention Advocacy at AIDS Foundation of Chicago in Chicago. And when I think of the communities I serve and the communities I engage with and how they feel about clinical trials, I think I'll build off of what Dazon is saying and agree with her, and also say I think there's a strong amount of curiosity and enthusiasm coupled with healthy skepticism and excitement. I think when we start talking about new technologies, people are really delighted that new things are being created and they want them sooner than they exist. So I definitely see a lot of energy, but I'm also gratified that there is a healthy skepticism. So they ask lots of questions and aren't just sort of taking it verbatim. They want to really dig in and understand. Thank you for that.
My homegirl, Nandi, what you got for us?
Thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. So my name is Nandi Lutuli, and I'm a Regional Stakeholder Engagement Advisor at AVAC. My community sees clinical research as a collaborative effort to get more HIV prevention products that people at risk can choose from. So clinical research to my community means more options and choices. Thank you.
Raphael?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Rafael Gonzalez. I'm the Community Programs Manager at Clinical Trials Unit here in San Francisco, Bridge HIV. What does clinical trials or clinical research mean to my community? 100% agree with Jim's point. There is definitely a healthy skepticism. I applaud that. I think people should be informed and empowered to question what it is that we're doing. And I also think that my community wants to know what's in it for them, but immediately. Yes, I think they understand the long run, medications that could help them stay healthier, but I also think that they want to know what's in it for them now. And that can be talked about in different ways. I think that, people want to know about compensation for their participation in research. I think people want to know how clinical trials can help them now with other issues that impact their lives.
And last but not least, gets a twist, because in that dating show, there's always a twist at the end. Kashija, tell us not only what your community thinks, but why is research important to your community? What is the interplay? Like, why do people show up, and why does research need your community to be there? You get the tough one.
Thank you. So, hi everyone. My name is Kahisho Baipanya. I'm the Community Engagement Manager with the HBTN and COVIPN, supporting sites in Southern and Eastern Africa. So, I will start first with the first question, that my community see research as a source of many things, and at the same time, very skeptical, and they see research as a place that can do more, though it does not do what they think it can do. They see research as a place that can do a lot of things, health, source of information, but they also think that it can do more. And I'm also going to request you to repeat the second one, which you asked me as the first person to answer.
Yeah. So why is it important for community to contribute to research? What is the researchers kind of getting? Like, we obviously know, as a former trial participant, I know they took a lot of my blood and that study couldn't go on without me. But what is it so important that communities truly engage, and why do they need to answer these questions about, why does community engagement matter, basically?
I would say it's important for communities to contribute in clinical research because it creates, number one, a balance, because communities won't feel that their voice is not heard. For example, communities are always willing to contribute and willing to take the risks that are involved in research. And sometimes communities feel that their voice is not necessarily heard. For example, they feel that research does not necessarily reciprocate as much as they would have expected to. For example, when it comes to issues pertaining to reimbursement, as much as participants are looking forward to come to their visit, it will be important for us to listen to their contribution in terms of how do they like to be reimbursed. I mean, for example, when you look at, for HIV, for example, when we look at communities that we say are at risk, you recruit participants which are busy every day, hustling in life, looking for things for their children and their families, and we also want them in our clinics. So the amount of time we require for them to spend in a day in our own clinics, we don't even reciprocate what they could have made out there, irrespective of what they're doing outside the clinic. So I think it's important for us to listen more, and even the ethics committees as well, to listen more, because it is not enough just to say, this is ethics approved, but communities still needs to contribute more beyond the protocols itself, but even to issues pertaining to reimbursement. How will this product be used when they get approved? So it's important for research to even go further. As much as we talk about broader stakeholders, but we need to get deeper in terms of how communities would like to contribute. Even here from communities, how would they like to contribute to the trials that we are doing as research?
I'm going to broaden this next one up because I think that all of you have touched on things that have happened around kind of people's skepticism, people needing to know more. So what are some great things you've seen that's happened to make people feel engaged and make it feel like you're like, okay, this was a trial or this was a network that really talked to my people, and like, what does that look like for you? And anyone can answer, but if you don't jump up and answer, you will be called on, because that's how the dating show works. Raphael is smiling at me. You get to go first.
All right. So how do folks feel like this is for them? Is that the question?
Yeah. How do they feel like I feel engaged enough to want to either walk through that door and volunteer myself, or even to like tell the people I know in my circle that might be interested?
Yeah, so when thinking about the community programs, community engagement team that we have here in San Francisco working on clinical trials, I think a big part that contributes to some of our success is that we are of the community. And we don't just show up in spaces when it's for recruitment purpose, right? We are embedded in the community. And I think that seeing us in our natural habitat makes folks feel comfortable. We are friends with the community that we serve. And so I think that there's this sense of camaraderie and trust to even engaging in the institutions that we're affiliated with. So I think that it's really important kind of thinking of these, if you think of like social influencers, we are all that, right? We all have our own networks, our own communities. And if they see that we are a part of this movement, that sense of trust that we've cultivated lends to folks feeling like they should engage and should participate with us.
Nandi, it looks like you are mulling that option over. I think you have some thoughts.
Please repeat your question for me,
So
Matt.
what are some best practices that kind of make people feel that they're engaged and that work? Like, what do we know that makes people want to be in trials? And how do we know that, community, that we're actually engaging community and not just like, hey, so I sent some pizzas to the CAB meeting the other week. I checked the box. Who's on the CAB? I don't know. People, I guess.
All right. So thank you. Yeah. So I think for me, I think I'd like to echo what Raphael said and what Kagiso mentioned earlier on. It's investing in communities, right? So Kagiso mentioned that especially in sub-Saharan Africa, most of the participants that we recruit and enroll in these trials are oftentimes, impoverished and, up and about trying to hustle, right? So I think it'd be very beneficial for trial sponsors and for trial researchers to actually invest in the social ills, right? Socioeconomic ills that are faced by some of our trial participants. So invest in whatever, in the priorities. So maybe learn about the priorities and the needs of your communities and work with them, partner with them to ensure that they also benefit from the partnership that is already formed between the trial site and the community. I think that is really essential, and it would help foster trust, build a collaborative effort, and really make a participant want to join and contribute more to research. So I think ensuring that the needs and priorities of our communities are also fulfilled and attended to by researchers and trial sponsors would benefit and would help this relationship to be more effective, I would say.
Jim Pickett, you look like a man who's heard a lot of stories about some people's bad dates and bad partnerships. Can you tell us what happens when some of this community engagement goes wrong? What are some examples of why we have these conversations in the first place?
Why do I look like the person who knows a lot about bad dates? And how did you find that out?
Because I feel like you have been the champion of the person who's been downtrodden, and you've gotten some justice for some folks who've been on a bad trial date.
Well, I think where things go wrong, so I would first co-sign everything that has been said prior to me, all great answers. And it's when trials, funders and trials sort of do the opposite. If you come in and you don't listen, if you come in and you don't respect community, if you come in and you're not engaging, if you come in with a bunch of BS. I mean, we've had funders and trials set up saying, oh, we can't do that with women because blah, 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 blah. And we all know it's BS. I'm not going to name names here today, but people probably can read between the lines. And it's obnoxious. It doesn't set up a respectful relationship. It doesn't foster trust. When we know that they're lying or they want to do something that is expedient. I've been in community consultations where community has been brought together. We've shared our thoughts and opinions and suggestions, and have seen all of them basically not taken up. And that's also, it's not to say that the community is always right. Sometimes we're going to have suggestions that don't fit or aren't workable, but to come in and meet with community and then completely ignore all suggestions, all ideas, but still getting to check off the box that you had that community engagement, that's a whole lot of BS.
Jim, that kind of sounds like a meeting we were in February 2012, circa. Huh.
It sounds like a few meetings, yes.
Or explaining what community does. I remember a particular meeting about douching practices once.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate when science comes to us and asks us for feedback and to explain things. I don't expect everyone to know things, but then it's what you do with what we give you. And if you just sort of go through the motions and then you take everything that we've given you, our experience, our wisdom, our time, and you basically trash it, that is not the way to do good community engagement. And sometimes it means having, like, going back and having those hard conversations, you know, pulling back from a challenging conversation or critique is also the wrong thing to do. When there is critique and when there are challenges, that's when we all need to lean in and engage further and find where we can have common ground. So it's not about avoiding conflict, but, you know, I see sometimes there is a sort of adversarial relationship that can happen between community and trials, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That can be a good thing. We're all, at the end of the day, looking right to support our communities and make sure our communities are healthy. And I think at the end of the day, we really need to be addressed and considered as experts. We know our communities better than scientists who come into our communities.
And if I could just add, actually, absolutely think it's crucial for us to listen to community. However, in addition to listening to community, I think we need to honor and respect people's expertise and feedback. And it's a taboo subject. I bring it up a lot, but it often has to do with funding and prioritizing our community's feedback. We can do all of these community consultations or listening sessions, but people have other things going on in their lives. And what we prioritize isn't necessarily the community's priority, even if what we're trying to do in the long run is, you know, produce something or find something that would benefit our community. Folks are thinking today, right now, do I have time to engage in a 1 or 2 hour community consultation, or should I find something to eat, whichever way that might mean? Or should I continue looking for a job or work on my resume? People have other priorities, and we need to find a way to embed ourselves in their priorities.
I'm going to kick it over to Dazon as a woman of the world who runs organizations on multiple continents and has been in many bodies in many spaces. How do we set these priorities and do this stuff? Where does community engagement start? Where does it stop? Are we at the local level, the hyper local level, like I am at your school versus I'm at your city town hall versus I am in your country versus I am, you know, all over the North American continent, and North America is not just the United States. So yeah, you've seen it all, done it all. Tell us.
Well, I'm still working on that because I got a long life to live. But I think in terms of your question, and if I may, I do want to circle back around too, is that all of what we're talking about is how do we make sure that research itself, that trials that are meant to benefit community in the long run, that how are they all using, understanding, and incorporating what I call, and Jim sort of spoke to it a little bit, indigenous expertise. Like, I think that the lived experience of the people, either whether we're looking for people to participate in trials, to educate community about trials, to raise literacy around research and health, or simply to be able to create studies in their communities for their communities, that the lived experience is a data set. And it is a data set that should be valued and should be powered to the same level and with the same credibility and respect as any of the other data sets that are used in our current trial designs. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then the second thing, in terms of what Nandi was talking about also, the other thing that I think is important is, how does this fit in my real world experience? And I know that that's a question that you might be thinking of, Matt, but in this instance, when it's about interesting people or getting folks interested in studies, I first start to talk, sorry, I have a puppy that just found a toy to play with, that we use everyday experiences that people are already engaged in and find valuable. So this is why I can answer your question and say it begins with community, it runs through the lives of people in communities, and then it ends with community. It starts and ends there because, for example, I could be in a room, people have their purses, or if they don't have their purses and they have their, pouches, or they might have a cabinet at home. First thing I ask is, when you have an ailment or when you have an illness or when you're trying to prevent something, what do you take? What do you already put in your body? What do you already do? Open your purse and pull out your prescriptions. Open your mind and pull out what's on your bathroom shelf or in your vanity cabinet. Don't you think that somebody had to put their body on the line to make sure that that particular drug or that particular medicine worked so that you could trust it and use it now? And that's why you carry it every day. That's where community engagement begins. And it's also where it ends. That what I am interested in to take care of myself and my family is what you're interested in finding out what works, how it works, and what works best for me. That's what I think. And to finalize that, I do believe that it is about making sure that whoever is affected by the particular thing that we're studying. So does it have a local context because of where it's being studied? Does it have a regional or a national context because of who gets to decide what happens with the study and who benefits from that study? Does it have a global context because at some point you want it to be useful all over the world by people? And does it also have an intersectional context, which means that all of these folks should have some way to be engaged in the planning, in the design, in the implementation, and in the outcomes of whatever particular study is afoot.
And Matt, I think I'd like to add to that, to respond to that answer as well. Thank you. So real engagement to me should never be confined geographically at the local level, because if it does, even if a clinical trial does succeed in answering a question, the ability to act on the research requires so many more stakeholders to be engaged. So the whole idea behind good participatory practice guidelines revolves around working with all of the different layers of biomedical HIV prevention trial stakeholders. So that is from local community-based stakeholders to faith leaders, national NGOs, the media, and international NGOs, all of which ensure that the fruits of research are delivered to the masses. So we have to go beyond local. That's why partnerships are so important, because trial sites and clinical trial networks focus on the local and the trials. And other organizations simultaneously work with all these other partners that are based nationally, regionally, and internationally. Whilst Kagiso, for instance, works in the trials, Jim, Dazon, and I work in partnerships with those trials to ensure the larger engagement of stakeholders. Also, engagement should never be confined to a time point. If consultation is about a protocol, and you never consult again, that's never really engagement. It's a once-off interaction. What we need to be building is engagement that is ongoing and continuous. That should occur at all stages of the research life cycle. So from trial design to results dissemination, and all the way through to the rollout stages. It's a continuous process. So often engagement gets fixed to a point in time, the informed consent, the enrollment, or maybe during the results dissemination process. But if you are only engaging with the results dissemination, you don't know the journey beforehand. And if you only engage with the protocol design, you don't know the journey ahead. Engagement needs to be a continuous journey on all these layers geographically, so local, national, regional, and globally. We want communities to be engaged not just in the trial, but in that greater context. That is in research and prevention programs of which trials are a part of. Thank you.
Oh, girl, it's like you're reading my mind about the question I had. Go ahead, Kichio.
Yeah, I just want to also to add on what Nandi said. It's actually just an example in parallel with what Nandi has just said, that is what we also heard from what civil society was saying, that yes, we appreciate that the local side might engage broadly as far as it can get, but that broadly, as the Nandi alluded to, GPP, it means also engaging beyond your local borders to ensure that various stakeholders, they support the trial, even if they might not be necessarily geographically within your own area. They might be somewhere in the country, but they can technically support your trials. I'll make an example that currently with COVID-19, one of the great things which has been happening is that civil society has been taking a lead in education and in dispelling myth, because they have been engaging with research, and just because they are asking questions, they are not necessarily against what is taking place, but they also want to contribute to a certain level. So I think what Nandi says, will help the clinical trials or researchers to have friends beyond research itself, and have friends in other sectors that the research doesn't necessarily reach those sectors.
Yeah, pause for questions from the audience, y'all. What would you say to researchers/sponsors' obligation to the community beyond the trial? And I know I have lots of thoughts on this, so I know the rest of you do too.
It might sound a bit like a broken record here, but again, I think funding has a lot to do with it, right? Not just funding the site when they are working on a clinical trial that you are leading. We are partners and we need to take care of each other even when we're not actively recruiting for a study. So I think I would strongly, strongly encourage funders and sponsors of clinical trials to reconsider how they interact with sites that they're asking to join them in participating in these clinical trials and implementing these interventions.
I think for me, I would say, I will answer this question to say that the communities expect researchers to take the lead after when these products have been approved in implementation, irrespective of whether government is slow to implement policies. Communities expect researchers beyond the trial to take the lead, not necessarily wait for interventions to be implemented. I'll make an example with PrEP. I mean, we knew a long time ago that PrEP has shown to work and it's working. And we know that policies are there, governments are implementing, have written policies, but the implementation of those policies are slow. Communities expect researchers to take the lead implementation of them. They don't understand issues pertaining to funding because they see researchers as people who can do far more than what we can. They see them as people who can implement now. So I think communities expect even more from researchers to commit, not necessarily on the trial, on the everyday things that are happening around the trial, but communities expect researchers to commit beyond when the product is shown to be successful, because it is discouraging for community to rally behind researchers during the trial. But when it has been said on the news that this product is working, then people don't see action. They are not going to look at politicians or policymakers. They are going to look at whom? Researchers whom they know they are close to them. They are going to look at that side to say, I know this thing was researched at that side. What is happening? I don't see anything about it anymore. And that is what typically happens. It went so quiet till governments come or policymakers come and say, we have funding to allocate for this product to implement it. Then we'll start with a small, a certain portion of our community across the country. So communities expect researchers to commit beyond, not necessarily wait for policymakers to start implementing. And that goes, it's an example with what we have seen with PrEP.
You're here.
Parallel question that I'm going to have Jim kick us off on.
So Matt, if you don't mind, Matt, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Kagiso just laid it out so beautifully. I would add a couple of things, is that what we've seen, and I think a good example is just what we've been through with the COVID-19 and the vaccine and that whole enterprise, where you had an entire world that was sitting on the edge of its seat, like, when is this thing coming? When is it coming? When is it coming? And then when they start to slowly show you the evidence from some of the vaccines, there's no plan. There's no real strategy for how to actually now get it into people's bodies for real, though. And I think that was similar to what we had with PrEP in the beginning of the PrEP implementation. So the first thing I think about is the fact that most of us do research literacy and we talk about these phases, and we stop with phase 3 as if phase 3 is all that we need to come out with the results of a trial and then figure out, well, now you've got a product, now take it from here. Managing expectations is really important, but most importantly is managing implementation is another one. That should be phase 4 if it's not already. I know that's considered in, post to market kind of study, but there's a different thing where implementation itself is a continuation of that same study, is a real important thing. And then beyond that is, how are we now measuring its utility, and how are we measuring the response from the community, and how are we measuring the true outcomes? That all of that has to have community engagement from soup to nuts, as they say, from the beginning to the end. And the end still ends with community saying, this works, it doesn't work, why it does, why it doesn't, and what better can be done, because you cannot be finished.
Absolutely. I was going to say to Jim, actually dovetailing off that conversation, is with the increased prevention modalities being available, how can we better support organizations to educate trial participants in an impartial way? But also, what is the expectation of just education on products that work? You know, one of the things that has baffled me since the beginning of this whole PrEP discussion is we're like, we don't know that PrEP in women can work. I'm like, but we did Partners PrEP that was in women, and we did Botswana that was in women. But now we don't know. Okay, y'all got some splaining to do. But Jim, how do we educate people on new modalities and then integrating them into trials? I know you have done a ton of this work on a whole lot of prevention modalities over time. And I would like you to speak to tell us some things.
Well, I think and I am sure everyone has great thoughts around this, and it really speaks to what people have already said and what Dazon was just saying, that first of all, we don't just come out of the box with a phase 3 study. So it's really engaging our communities around the whole process. And even when things are in early stages, when they've moved into phase 1 with a small amount of people, you do that work. You go out there and you do education around that. You help people understand what's happening. Now, part of this I kind of fell into naturally, because when I started doing this work, I was very much interested, and still am, in rectal microbicides. And there was nothing in late stage trials. The only trials we had to talk about were early stage trials. So that's all we went out and did. But I found communities were really, really interested. They want to understand how things move through the pipeline. They want to understand the kind of decisions and trade-offs that have to be made around molecules and modalities, and what will be of interest to people, how we determine what people will want, how we go beyond acceptability to desirability. And so I think when we're engaging with our communities early on and not waiting, we get much more rich information, and we get that kind of feedback that can really help the scientific process. And then our communities really benefit from understanding how these trials work, and they're not caught off guard when we have a product that comes out the other end and is ready to go. I think a lot of us were collectively caught off guard with PrEP. We weren't ready. We were at least flat-footed. We weren't ready to kind of spring into action and figure out how to now implement something, our first ever kind of pill for prevention. We didn't really know what to do with it. And I think that is on all of us. But I think the more we can engage communities across trials, regardless of whether trials are happening or not. We were doing, back to a rectal microbicide example, I was doing rectal microbicide talks in places all over the country and the world that didn't have rectal microbicide trials. So I think I will end my point by saying, I think a lot of this education really needs to come from community organizations and not the trial itself and not CABs. We need to have support for community organizations to do this work so they can be kind of nonpartisan. They're not about the trial. They're not funded by the trial. Funding has to come from somewhere, of course, but that funding allowing people to have these ongoing conversations, so it's not transactional, it's not specific to a trial, and it's not being funneled through a specific sponsor or funder's lens.
We got some questions from the chat, y'all. In no particular order, what, if anything, should be the role of host country governments or local or national in community engagement around specific trials beyond the requirements of a government trial sponsor interaction or beyond a sponsor community interaction? So I think this speaks to some of the bridging we're talking about, of how do you get what, if you sponsor the trial, you said yes to the trial, and now something comes out of the trial, what do? Do you look like the Americans post COVID vaccines? Or do you have an actual plan of what if this works and we got to get it to people?
So I think a reason why some of us, I don't know, why I had to spend a moment on that is because, that question is almost so site specific, Because I would say that for me, it would depend on that government. It would depend on what country we're talking about is hosting. It would depend on who's in charge in that country where it's being hosted of what I want them to do. For example, if we're talking about the United States in the last 4 years, the last thing I really want to do is wait for that government to do something, because whatever it is that last government was going to do was not going to help me and my people. So that would be the first thing, is to be very considerate of how to answer that question in terms of what country, who's running the country, and who's making these decisions and what their commitments are to their own people. So I would think that the first thing I would say is that for the role of a host country and its government is that it is totally committed once it agrees and is in partnership in hosting a study, is that it agrees to apply the entire human rights framework to the existence of that trial, that we're looking at equity, that we're looking at dignity, that we're looking at protection of people's rights, and that we're making sure that the people who participate in those studies are also front of the line in terms of benefiting from what comes out of those studies that work. So that for me would be it, is applying first and foremost some equitable and just principles and expectations from the researchers to use a complete, not just the what do we know as the certification stuff that you have to do to make sure the studies are beneficent and that they're respectful, but that they are actually human rights centered, because that would make them people centered, which means that people come first. That's what a host government should do, is make sure that any trial is living up to those standards.
I've got one that's going to go to start with Kashijo and Raphael, because you are at sites, and then the rest of you feel free to jump in. Are the CAB truly representative of the community? Which is, of course, a loaded question.
Well, it depends from which context you would like to answer the question. Because as Nandi alluded earlier, that community engagement has to happen in all the cycles and levels, whether locally, nationally. And it depends from the site itself. How did they organize their CAB? You find that in certain sites, a CAB is organized and represented by various organizations that are embedded in the community. So through those organizations, the CAB is able to represent various sectors of the community, various sections of the community. The message is able to spread it across. The site is able to hear various information. However, the CAB is not necessarily the only representative of the community itself. So the community can be represented in various ways. That is why GPP talks about broader stakeholder engagement, because even within those different sectors of the community, there are other people who are not represented. So there should be stakeholders which the sites also have a relationship with outside the CAB, to ensure that you reach different people at different times, at different areas. And that will really help the site. So the site cannot necessarily depend on the CAB alone. Different stakeholders, hence the word broader, broader stakeholder engagement. So the CAB is not necessarily the fully community represented. So broader is the way to go for various sites, for any research that wants to touch community at different levels for trials.
Yeah,
Matt, I would like.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Nandi, please.
Thank you. Sorry, Raphael. I just wanted to say that in my experience, having worked for a trial site here in South Africa and having worked for the HVT, and I know that CABs are absolutely essential, but they are not sufficient, because we need multiple engagement mechanisms. And with meaningful community engagement, we know that we need community advisory boards in the context of clinical trials, but we also need all these other additional stakeholder advisory mechanisms. We've seen in a number of trials the importance of developing global community advisory mechanisms. The ECHO trial was a great example that showcased the importance of developing an independent global mechanism that was in addition to relying on local site CABs. And both Merck and Gilead in their islatravir and FTAF and lenacapavir trials are using the very same process. So this idea of a global community advisory mechanism, not instead of CABs, but in addition to them, is really important to allow for the engagement that goes beyond local to national, regional, and global communities. I'll end there for now.
Thanks, Nandi. Raphael, you had something on that?
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Kaisha was saying. I love the idea of maybe redefining what a CAB is and not framing it in this very rigid way. Even convening multiple people at the same time can be difficult. I find that some of the best conversations that inform the work I do happen at a bar, in bed, it comes in different ways. And I think that we need to get out of framing our community advisors to who attends one particular meeting.
Dezan?
Yeah, I'm chomping at the bit. I know this is probably going to be one of my questions later, but I know we're running out of time and I love listening to the audience questions. Here's the thing. First and foremost, community engagement belongs to the community, belongs in the community, belongs with community. So for example, one of the biggest changes that I would love to see, and I saw the FDA question, and I think that this in some way partially answers a little bit of that, is that it must be respected. I go back to the indigenous expertise, and the lived experience must be respected as integral a part of the science as the molecules that they're coming up with to create these products, right? And so community engagement must be led by community. It must live with community. It must be examined and evaluated and moderated, if you will, and monitored by community with the resources that's needed to come along with it. It just bothers me to no end that gazillions of dollars go into research and go into research for all of the right reasons and most of the time. But that ends up in institutions. It ends up with industry. It ends up with labs. It ends up in everybody else's hands, except for the community that's needed for those trials in the first place. So community engagement has to start with the community in its ownership, not just in its expectation for what we get out of it. And another part is that the CAB process, I agree with everybody else, is that it's just one aspect of the overall expectation of what engagement looks like from the community standpoint, not from the researcher standpoint. And that in and of itself means that even a group of people who are brought together to look at a given trial from its beginning to its end must have a level of authority, must be able to initiate accountability, and must be able to expect some level of response to their concerns, their questions, and their ideas for how a trial might need to go. And to give you an example of what Sister Love has been doing lately is we reformed how we would engage, and I don't call them CABs, we call them collabs. They are community organized leadership and accountability boards that engage people as leaders in their own lives and in the community, but it's also established by community in a way that says, here's how we will hold our research partners accountable and how we'll hold ourselves accountable to ensuring that this trial is the most meaningful that it can be for the community that's most engaged. That's just one example. I got lots, but that's just one example of how we are literally disrupting the community engagement field as it sits right now.
And since Dezan referenced it, I'm going to bring up this question, but I'm going to take a little bit of moderator's privilege and tweak it just a little bit. So the question is, how do we get the FDA, and I'm changing that to how do we get regulatory authorities to value community engagement and see the importance of community when holding pharma accountable for trials and the research that they conduct? Often we are thought of the regulatory, they're like, oh, did you put something in place? And the IRB says, oh, look, they have a plan. Okay, cool. And then nobody really checks on anything again till never, as long as we hit recruitment targets and you hit your endpoints. But as people who work in communities, what are ways, and we know that, for instance, the FDA in the United States is currently doing an ongoing review of its trial conduct and its regulatory styles and looking out for trials. What would you want to tell regulatory authorities that they should know and look for to actually know that community engagement happened and how it's happening within the trial context? Because I can tell you some studies that have happened recently with products that are on the market now that the numbers look good until you think about who actually is most impacted. And then you start questioning some things about, did we really approve a drug for people who are already well off? Oh, we did. Okay. Anybody else have some thoughts on that? What would you want regulators to change?
Yeah, I'm turning to the cabotegravir study recently, who did not allow sites to enroll one demographic, right? They set targets. It started from the beginning. It wasn't an afterthought. So perhaps, institutional review boards could take note from that and encourage that there be specific allotments to who we're recruiting to ensure representation. And so that once this does get approved, different communities feel certain that this works for them because there was representation of them.
So I'm going to ask the odd dog question, but then I'm going to ask you something else to go along with it. So do we think community engagement is resourced enough? And what is the appropriate level of resourcing for community engagement?
So community engagement and good participatory practice guidelines are fundamentally based and grounded on research literacy. And as the research gets more complex and as the context of prevention, human rights, and COVID-19 gets more complex, the need for research literacy is expanding exponentially. So when I started working in HIV prevention space, it was a little easier to do research literacy because we had phase 1, phase 2, 2B, and phase 3 trials. But all those trials were all placebo controlled, and research literacy was just a bit easier to do then. Over the past couple of years, we've had to think about how to roll out oral PrEP in the community while researchers were studying long-acting injectable cabotegravir, the dapirian vaginal ring, the Janssen vaccines, and antibodies, which was hard. But now we are talking about external controls, background incidents, recency assays, and community engagement is not resourced enough because the world is more complex. So we are probably funding community engagement like we should have done. So we're probably funding now community engagement like we should have done 10 years ago. And the world that we live in today is a bit more complex. So we need to double or even triple funding for research literacy and community engagement. We are beginning to spend more time talking about these new trial design concepts, and that takes literacy building. And we are all learning, not just communities. This is not about communities being educated to then engage. This is all about the stakeholders learning together. One of the reasons we've been working with partners like Jim and Dazon and AVEX Trial Design Academy of advocates from around the world is to learn, not just as community members, but we interact with the statisticians, with the clinical trials, with the product developers, because that's how engagement happens in real time when we're learning together. Just last week, AVEC had about 50 young women from all the countries that are going to host islatravir trial for PrEP. And these young women engaged with the investigators and the product developer in an open forum to learn about the trial, to challenge and ask questions in a participatory way and create an ongoing mechanism for researchers and product developers to engage and work with communities, civil societies, and advocates. And as the trials look at active control arms, external controls, background incidents, and recency assays, all these concepts are relatively new, but not only for HIV advocates and communities, they are actually new for everybody involved in the HIV prevention space. And all these conversations are new conversations that are happening, that have been happening over the last couple of years. All of these factors need to be considered, and that's why at its heart, future trial design and community engagement have to rely on robust research literacy, which means more money. We need to ensure that when people come into the conversation, whether they are statisticians, ethicists, advocates, or product developers, that everyone is coming with a shared language, a shared understanding, and these concepts so that we can have a robust, meaningful, and good participatory practice. So we know there's a lot of complexity out there. We all have to improve our literacy, and we need to be doing this literacy together. Again, research literacy requires more money and more funding.
I'm gonna let that be the thought for that, because that was everything. Thank you, Nandi. Everyone, last thought, best thought. What do you want people to think, take forward, to do that we can change and have more engagement of community, have more meaningful engagement of the community? If you want to give them a marching order, but be rapid fire.
I think that a big takeaway here, and again, I keep repeating this, is funding. So I think the way that Nandi just, explained that was beautiful. If funding's not going to come to you from sponsors, I think an alternative could be more collaboration, joining forces, joining funding. I think of Dr. Michelle Andrasik, who's brought in a different angle of sourcing research at the HVTN by doing more socio-behavioral research. So finding ways to join forces and join that fund.
And also, I'll say also my parting shot will be in line with funding, that community engagement will need more funding than we thought before to COVID-19. And in the setup that, for example, in the sites that I'm supporting, things have changed in that sites have started to engage their community advisory groups through your Zoom, through your Microsoft, and that also has created even more, created a space for more funding that will be needed, because sometimes the very same communities that we want to engage don't have resources to access this type of communication that we are using. So we would need even more funding to reach people more than before. Some sites are even funding those communities to ensure that they're able to disseminate information, to teach them, keep communities updated, and which is money which was not budgeted before. So we would need money more than before to ensure that we continue with research literacy.
So Jim's going to get the last word here because I believe in that. I think, one, that the people that we're talking about live intersectional lives. And so our responses to that must be intersectional responses. Researchers and trials aren't always built to be intersectional because they have to be laser-like focused on what it is that they're trying to achieve with a study. Communities can be and must be intersectional, including the community-based organizations. So I want to leave with this, is that every study should think about incorporating intersectionality into its thinking, which means it has to bring in community-based organizations as partners and the communities they represent, so that they also can be intergenerational, as Nandi has laid out is incredibly important, that they can be fully integrated into the trial design, not as an oh, by the way, and not as an aside effort, or not as something that's just an extension of a requirement in the grant to fund the research, and that it should be that we should consider the innovations that come from community to be engaged. And that's how we've seen using innovative community ideas shift some of how trials are designed and implemented and who's even included. I'm using the two recent studies that are rolling out that have actually figured out how to include cisgender women in the US in HIV prevention studies, which we've been fighting for 30 years. And it must be interconnected with some of the other issues and some of the other responses to things that are being experienced in the lives of the people who we want to participate in our trials. Thank you.
I have 6 words. Communities determine choices. Listen to communities.
Ooh. Thank you, Jim. Back to you, Linda. Thank you for coming to Matthew's dating show. Will you date a trial? That's what you got to figure out.
Great data trial.
Bravo indeed. That was just unbelievable, and a tour de force through everything that is critical, key, and so important to the work we do. So I just want to just recommend this wonderful panel of experts, truly experts deluxe, underscore that community is the cornerstone, the foundational heart of clinical research. There is no such thing as clinical research without community. And I heard words today like partnership, whole journey, mutual respect, together, integration, open forums, participatory, research literacy, adequate funding, adequate resources, joined forces, intersectionality, intergenerationality, and interconnectedness. Awesome, just really, I think, a PhD on how it should be done. And I would say required listening for every single person who is going to fund, design, embark on, or participate in research in the future. So thank you, Dazon, Raphael, Nandi, Jim, Kagiso, and of course, Matt, your wonderful moderation. We just really appreciate that. And I think that really draws to a close an exceptional set of webinars. So thank you to Veronica, I see there, Stefan. It's been wonderful to partner with you, Roger, to Holly and Nora, also for the work they've done to put this together. And with that, I say forward with prevention. It is the only way we can see the end of this epidemic. And I am going to hand back to Roger with that. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you very much, Linda Gale. I'm so sorry to have to cut here because we could have gone on for a long time, and that's a very meaningful, deep discussion that we need to have more often and that we need to make more public and to bring on board more people in this conversation. So I'd like to thank all who participated in today's discussion. I also like to thank my colleague, and if they could put their camera on so people could see who is behind these webinar. It's been an enormous amount of work. Honestly, organizing that as a 1 day or 2 days event, it's a one-off. Organizing that over 6 months, 6 times, it's 6 times the amount of work. And I would like to thank my colleague for their energy and their goodwill. That's Holly James, Deborah Donnell, Veronica Miller, Linda Gale Becker, Stephen Wallace, and that would not have been possible with even more support from Holly Pruden and Noura El Rassi. I'd like also to thank all the panelists who have been there in all the previous discussion over the last 6 months. I'd like to draw your attention to complementary work done by your colleague at the Forum for Collaborative Research led by Veronica and also by EVAC. We're all working towards building research literacy and being more inclusive of community and a meaningful inclusion. All presentation and panel discussion are available on the Enterprise website, www.vaccineenterprise.org. This panel will also be available in the coming days. This is not over. This is not goodbye. We will now think about how to capture the rich discussion we had today and what we're going to do next. There will be a next. Thank you and see you soon.